I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the cyber initiatives at the Aspen Institute, and I am here to introduce our next set of panelists. We will have a slight programming change due to the vagaries of actually hosting things in person. Paul Abbate, the Deputy Director of the FBI, is running late today and not able to make it. But the good news is we already have one former Deputy Director of the FBI on stage today. So I'm welcoming back Kelly Bourne of the Hewlett Cyber Initiative, Joyce, former Deputy Director of the FBI, now with PwC, Mieke, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy at the Pentagon, and Kevin Nandia of FireEye, one of the industry's leading thinkers and threat researchers. So thanks very much for continuing to stick with us today at the Aspen Cyber Summit. And Kelly, over to you.
Garrett, thank you. Yes, I'm back. Nice to see all of you today for this conversation about nation states and organized crime. I want to make this a little bit more of a conversation, so I have about a half dozen questions for you all, but then also really want to welcome you to ask questions of one another because it's such an interesting panel we've got here. But I think I want to start, Sean, with one for you, which is really how have you seen the landscape of cybercrime evolve over the last decade? It was about 10 years ago that you first started in 2011 as Deputy Director of the FBI. And what do you see as the front lines today?
So I'll do my best first to impersonate Paul Abbate. But I really think the threat landscape, and we've heard, I think, from multiple folks this morning, that it is constantly evolving. And one thing that I think we all see is it's constantly changing. But I think when you look at the criminals, I think probably 20 years ago, to be sort of in the business, you had to be very technical. Mm-hmm. Right? And those were the people still, when you look at the Eastern European area where a lot of the prolific hackers emanated from, that was the thing. Now we've seen it really, them becoming, right, cybercrime as a service and proliferating their malware and their tools so that you're seeing, those of you out there that are listening that are as old as I am, if you remember those old Nigerian scam letters, it has really just proliferated, I think, in the cyber realm. And when you look at, and then furthermore on the criminals, like the ransomware, it's almost like a gold rush. Like, where can we make money? And so, Michael mentioned in the previous panel about the economics. So I think we've seen a great change there and a rush to what I think a lot of companies are dealing with right now. On the nation state, I think it's about, really the barriers to entry are so low. So it's not like you have to have a standing army. It's not like you need a nuclear arsenal. You actually need a team of smart people that give them the ability to do things that many nation states were doing. So I think you're seeing a lot more nation states that typically we didn't see in that space come into that space, and that, to me, is concerning in itself.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, Mieke, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well from your respective perches of just how you've seen the landscape evolve in the time that you've been in this field.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, right? I think early on, the nation-state capability was really the thing that we worried about, because when a nation-state's able to put its resources towards developing significant disruptive capability, that was something that worries us from the national security perspective. But as we're talking about here, the ransomware as a service, it makes those disruptive tools available to a much wider range of people, and we're seeing increasingly fuzzy relationships between nation-state actors and criminals, and particularly worried about those nation-states that create a safe haven and a comfortable environment for the criminal actors to operate in. And that is something that we have to start addressing directly with those nations. But I think it is a real challenge because, as we all saw with Colonial, the criminal actor now has the ability to impose consequences on the average American as they go about their lives in a way that was unimaginable, I think, 10 years ago. And I think that's something that is part of the reason why I, as a defense official, am sitting here on this panel, because it's now at a nation-state threat level. And it's now at a national security threat level. That is something that we have to take on. We cannot just sort of sit back and protect our own networks and defend our way out of the situation. And you saw that in 2018, where the department said we have to be able to go outside of our networks and try and disrupt adversaries where they are. That was something that we did in response to the 2016 elections. But the criminal, especially the ransomware actors, have risen in priority for the Department of Defense in a way that we actually spend a fair amount of resources focusing on this threat.
Yeah, I think two changes I saw, and by the way, whenever you go last, you have to put the last breadcrumbs on the table. But the two changes that I think accelerated over the last few years is having an anonymous currency clearly enables bad guys, period. And so with the rise of the digital or the cryptocurrencies, I think we saw more lucrative and more anonymous criminal attacks. And then it was somewhere around 2016 or 2017, which means I was 5 years later than when it really happened. I noticed whoever's breaking in and whoever's doing the crime aren't even the same people anymore. So there was a time where doing the blocking and tackling to stop like 90% of the drive-by shootings on the information highway, that was good enough to stop the criminals because they were looking for the lowest hanging fruit. But now I think the criminal element is buying the access from folks that we're having a harder time putting in a bucket as to who they are. So we're responding to about 100 breaches, a little more than that right now. And on the criminal ones, I'm not sure whoever got initial access is the same person as who's actually conducting the crime. So that's a long-winded way of saying they might be getting better, and that there'll be a criminal element that's operating above the slop, the low-hanging fruit, as I called it. And for those folks that are trying to protect themselves, let's say from 99% of the threat actors instead of just 90% of the criminal, they'll do pretty good. But you're seeing the tools and tactics of the criminal element rising.
Kelly, I think an important question out of here, though, is why does it matter? Like the threat landscape, why does it matter
How
that
does it
it's
affect
changing?
the rest of us outside of
That's right,
government? Yeah.
and all those people in the companies listening, like there are a lot of people that say, well, it doesn't matter about attribution. And I would say, au contraire. Right, and to really understand the threat, and this is where I think you get into Director Easterly's statement about defense. Well, to understand defense and to play defense, you have to understand the risk, right? And right now, I don't think the government has the ability to understand the risk, and I don't think the private sector has the ability to understand the risk. And if you understand the risk, I think you're able to more effectively manage that risk, right? Like we're all keep saying cyber's a risk. The reason why it's so different is policymakers don't understand it, legislators don't understand it, and most business people don't understand it, right? So when we talk about this threat landscape changing, all those risk professionals out there and practitioners every day, they have to understand what does that mean to how they actually respond and mitigate, and unfortunately, as Kevin and I know so well, recover, right? And actually learn from that. And I think that's where it's important on both sides to really say, okay, the threat landscape is changing, but what does that mean for us?
Well, and I think that relates to the next question I would ask, which is, as we're seeing these blurrier lines between nation-state adversaries and non-state actors, you've talked a little bit about attribution, but what are the real practical implications of this? Does that affect, for example, from the FBI's perspective, the ability to impose costs?
So impersonating my friend again, I don't think it does. I mean, we're seeing, all intelligence agencies around the world have used proxies as long as nation states have been spying. So I think what, going back to what Kevin was saying and Mieke mentioned, it's these blurring of lines and being able to, I think, delineate and understand sort of who is doing what, so you can actually impose those costs and consequences. So this isn't just kind of a defensive play. You have to play a good defense, you have to actually know and understand the offense, and you can't be on defense all the time.
I would say since the start of the administration, we've seen a real increase in the focus on going after the criminal actor. DOJ and FBI have set up some new task forces to focus on this area. Our cooperation in the Defense Department with our law enforcement partners has really increased. And I think that you've seen, you saw this in the Lisa Monaco press conference about the Colonial Pipeline wallet seizure, the Rule 41 cleanup of the Microsoft web shells. You've seen the government thinking about much more creative use of its tools and authorities to try and help protect the American people, to try and impose additional costs on the adversary, all the way up to the President of the United States addressing his concerns about ransomware directly with a foreign head of state, which we've not seen before. And that's actually a big step of trying to address this through the entire spectrum of the relationship between the criminal and the nation-state actor, from the lowest level individual on keyboard who's in it for the profit, all the way up to trying to change the orientation of a nation-state about its, how it's going to do enforcement. So it's a much more cohesive approach to the problem, I think, than we've seen before. And I think that it's really trying to get at, what are the motivations of the people? This can't just be about securing our systems or going on offense about tools, but we have to think about how we impose costs on in a much more significant way. And this is really a whole of government effort that we've brought to bear here.
Thanks, Mieke. Kevin, anything you want to add here, Sean? Or I'd love to also move on to questions around harboring cyber criminals, but anything?
I guess might as well add something, even though I don't even think this addresses your question. As I was thinking about it, I think we're all going to come up with, no nation likes ransomware. And I think we can come up with rules of engagement that will apply to criminal elements, and you'll have countries that abide by those rules and say, these are crimes, we don't want to deal with it, and if you're a nation that harbors these folks and you don't impose consequence, maybe we will. But I don't think we'll ever have rules of engagement for espionage because of the asymmetry and the fact that when you really sit down and think about it, it's just hard to come up with an arrangement where North Korea would say, yeah, okay, those are the rules we'll abide by. And the question just is, where's that line where national interests become criminal? But I think there's a large bucket of criminal activity that we can define, that you can have a bunch of nations aligned behind and impose a lot more consequence on, to either the people that conduct those crimes or to the nations that are harboring those folks and allowing them to do it. And ransomware, quite frankly, is probably the easiest one to define and go kill it with a whole international alliance and a lot of nations that want to just put it to bed over time.
But I would add, Kevin, to what you're saying, it's not just the government's actions, right? So when we talk about the whole theme here of systemic risk, and we talked in several previous panels about critical infrastructure, 80 to 90% of the U.S. critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. Okay, so to me, 80 to 90% of the intelligence should be coming from the private sector, right? And I think the private sector has a responsibility to do a much better job managing that risk, right? And there's such a disparity between some organizations that do a phenomenal job and maybe some that don't feel the need to invest so much. And then how do we change the paradigm with the government, right? So Jen mentioned, hey, one of the things that's still there with the government was bureaucracy, right? How do we get rid of those jurisdictional lines? How do we get rid of, this committee has oversight over this agency, so we're going to put authorities in this place? And how do we actually embed and integrate the private sector into these actions? Now, you see it with some of the ISPs out there and some of the companies that actually have done some takedowns, but I think that cooperation, that integration, going back, everyone's mentioned it, team sport, collaboration, all of that. I would say it's great to have informal relationships that we like each other. I think it has to be hardwired to work.
Yeah, I appreciated an op-ed I think you'd written in the Washington Post recently about this. Yeah. So moving on to nation states harboring cyber criminals, something we've seen a lot of. Would love to hear your thoughts on the implications of this. Is there a point at which this kind of assistance turns criminal operations into actually nation-state activity, and what does that mean for the kinds of authorities that can be brought to bear here?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really tough factual question, and it requires a fair amount of intelligence to be able to sort of figure out what the relationship state is between the nation state and the criminal. And I really appreciate some research that Jay Healy had done on sort of this taxonomy of levels of state responsibility in this area. But one of the things that we try to model and try and encourage other nation states to do is that, we have seen in other countries that their nation state capability, those guys will like hack for the country by day and go home and hack for profit at night. And that's never something that we would allow in the United States. And if any defense employees are doing that, I think the FBI would like to have a word with you about it. But we have a sense of responsibility of our own forces. So we have highly capable people inside the Department of Defense, but they're not out there committing these kinds of attacks on other nations, where we see other nation states using that in a variety of environments. And then some other states who find advantage in allowing this sort of ecosystem to flourish, where there's sort of loose connections between the nation state and the criminal actors. And they may use them for access, they may use them for obfuscation, they may not have direct control in it, or they may, and so that's a very tough intelligence question to answer. But the bigger issue is, like, how do you get nation states to take responsibility for the threats that emanate from their territory? How do you say, look, you're either creating a permissive environment or you're directing attacks? Like, we need to have a conversation about this country to country, at least from the Defense Department. And meanwhile, right, the FBI and DOJ continue on their business of going about prosecuting the individuals. But it does become, at some level, a conversation between countries that we have to talk to them about, like, look, you really have to stop. You really have to get this under control. And you're starting to see those conversations happen now, not just from the US, but around the world. And you see that in a lot of the attribution statements that happened internationally on the Hafnium.
Hafnium was a great example of that kind of collaboration.
Yeah.
Anything either of you would add to that, or Sean, you have some?
I don't know why Kevin's pointing at me. I actually think we have started, and the government has initiated several groups to try to bring some of that collaboration. And as many of us know, right, it's a multi-pronged approach. So it's the State Department, it's the Department of Justice. I argue it's the private sector. Right? It is a multiple. It's the Department of Treasury with sanctions, right? It is that multi-pronged approach to doing this, but we've got to establish those norms. And right now, I don't know if anyone up here knows, but I'm not aware of any norms in the cyber environment, right, that actually exists where we just say, no, that's a red line. That is not acceptable behavior, and you will suffer consequences for that behavior. And I think we're getting closer to do that. I think the UK has been a leader in that dimension. And folks, if you haven't read, the UK just came out with their National Resilience Strategy, and it actually is, I think, a great approach where they're looking at, hey, do you understand the risk? We already talked about that. Like, as a risk practitioner, we all need to understand what this risk truly encompasses. What are you doing to prepare, mitigate, respond, and recover? And then, as Director Easterly mentioned previously, this is everybody's job, all the way down to the user. When she said, hey, if I could tell everyone to do one thing, MFA, I'm with you on doing the MFA, but it's everyone's job. And that is not the culture of the society we live in right now, right? It's the CISO's job, or it's CIS's job, or it's the FBI's job. No, it's all of our job. It's truly that team sport.
Yeah, I think if you go out a few years, everybody's going to figure out which countries harbor criminals or lack the technical infrastructure to pierce anonymity and impose risk or consequence to them. And you'll see different nations whose citizens have a whole different experience on the internet. I mean, when I look at all the remediation plans that PwC's written over the years and we've written over the years, over time, you're just blocking every IP address out of Russia, and then you're blocking every IP address from the service providers that the Russians use, and then you're blocking every IP address of the IP addresses. And granted, you're just putting your finger in the dike as it starts to leak, but we're going to get better at this no matter what. And for the countries that want to genuinely be part of a global economy, they're going to have to start imposing rules that meet the requirements of other nations. So I don't think it's going to get worse. I think it'll get better over time, and it's already happening naturally. There's already a whole different experience. I bet if all of us flew to Moscow right now and tried to access, I don't know, any defense industrial base company, you're not going to get there. That would be my guess. If that's not the case, probably want to talk to those DIB companies that change their...
As SRMA for the DIB, we hope that's not the case.
Yeah.
You can't do
But that being said, it's obvious that there are certain nations that harbor the criminal element, maybe even offer or promote some of these activities. But I feel like that's starting to change already.
So coming back to a point that several of you have made about cyber norms, the lack of any clearly defined red lines at this point, but curious, when you think about China versus Russia versus Iran, are there beginnings, coming to your point, of rules or norms there? How do you see each of these nation states operating differently when it comes to these questions?
I would say that there is, in observation, I don't know that this is written down anywhere, but we have not seen a nation state sponsor a cyber attack that's the equivalent of an armed attack. And we've been very clear about that as a red line for the United States, that the equivalent of an armed attack is going to get you a response. But I think below that, I think it's very difficult to define norms. And, as someone, I recognize norms are often defined by state practice, and so I'm in the state practice business, and not necessarily in the norm writing business. But we think very carefully about that when we engage in activity. We think about, what is the reciprocal risk here? What is this? Do we stand behind this as a nation? Are we comfortable with the activity? Do we feel like we're doing the right thing here? And so I think over time you will see a body of behavior from responsible nation states, from democracies who are very capable in cyber, of the things that they do and don't do. But I think it's really hard to have a normative conversation with other countries because so much of this activity is clandestine. And so you can't really have sort of the open conversation that you do in the nuclear arena, where it's like, let's verify each other's capability and let's talk about what targets we each have, because that kind of transparency just isn't available in the cyber domain. So I think we have to rethink how we establish that dialogue in the international space with allies and adversaries alike.
Can I ask you, Mieke, can you define an armed attack for me? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think we have definitions, but the challenge of the armed attack is, of course, it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. There are, it's a significant consequence that we would assume. This is not the legal definition, so I apologize to my OGC colleagues. We're probably freaking out about this, but we're talking about destructive, loss of life, serious injury, those sorts of things. So we have not seen that. Now, it's obviously in the purview of a nation state to decide a particular attack is the equivalent of an armed attack and respond via force if they chose to, but we have not seen that happen yet in the international environment.
I think that'll make it interesting, like you even just look at colonial, I think that was a criminal element, doing a criminal attack in a nation that allows that sort of thing to happen, but I think there's a ton of unintended consequence there. So the hard part in cyber will be, holy crap, we did not want that to happen when we went on offense, and we blew it up by accident. So it'll be really hard to come up, in my opinion, with a red line in cyber. It's the infamous, you go back to Ronald Reagan's, you'll know it when you see it, comment on some other topic. It's a tough one. A lot of people have thought about it for a long time. And I just think on offense, you can't always predict the consequences of even encrypting a drive. You don't know if the server is going to crash in 5 minutes or 45 minutes. And then you heard about the DNS reliance. I mean, one domino falls, and next thing you know, people aren't getting water in Houston, and you're like, wow, didn't plan that one.
Yeah, it makes it hard to establish norms.
Yeah, this is actually a really important thing, I think, for the criminal element to be thinking about, though, when they're thinking like, oh, I want to stay off the radar of the most powerful nation on the world with really large and impressive cyber capability, is that you, given what we were talking about with systemic risk, you may not know when that business system that you think you are compromising for fun and profit, from the criminal's perspective, is actually going to lead to physical consequences in the real world, because you may not know the dependencies. And so you may trip over something that is going to put you on the radar of people like me, and that's not going to be a fun day for you in the long run. But that, I think that it's a very delicate thing, and we have to think a lot about sort of what are the interdependencies and what are the potential downstream effects of these things. And I think Kevin's right that like people could trip over something into a much bigger incident than they thought when they start in this activity.
Which again makes it really hard to enforce norms if you don't really know the intention.
Yeah.
Let me challenge you on that one.
Sure.
All right. Do you agree that this country has lost billions of dollars in intellectual property?
Yes.
Okay, so my challenge to you then is, when you talk about norm setting and how
Yeah.
difficult it is, do you think we should be doing it?
I think norm setting for espionage is going to be complicated. I really do, because the asymmetry is why North Korea is going to develop more of a cyber component. They're not going to beat us with tanks. I don't know if they know that, but they're probably not going to beat us with tanks. But cyber is just the asymmetry allows them to invest more. So I do believe criminal, we can define it. We can define as, and nations will sign it. We hate ransomware, let's do that, and impose economic risk to the nations that harbor those actors. Espionage, I don't think we're going to come up with a ton of agreement.
But I think, we get into definitional things about what espionage
yeah.
is. But the nation state responsible for stealing most of the intellectual property does that for economic advantage, right? The United States actually.
The infamous, like, where's the fine line between I'm securing my nation through economic advantage,
absolutely.
right? There's somewhere it's going to blur, right?
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
But the United States does not define, right? The collection
Right.
of foreign intelligence
Yeah.
is about intent and capabilities.
Well,
Yeah.
that's why I hesitate when you said billions of dollars in damage, because stealing the IP, then you got to go and do the work to replicate it. But I'd still say it's probably in the billions. I think we've lost a lot of competitive advantage.
I mean, we did try to define that as a norm in the
Yeah.
Obama administration and address that directly. And for a while, we did see some limitation of activity.
I think you saw, what I think we saw anyways, we used to see over 80 attacks from one group in China to steal IP, and it went down to like 5 1 month before President Xi met with Obama. So clearly there's centralized control of this group anyway. And what was amazing is all the attacks against the hedge funds or the companies doing M&A in China did go down, at least from our observables. But I feel like the defense industrial base is still fair game.
I mean, I don't like hearing that.
Well, I'm just interpreting observations.
But yeah, I think, right, but this is an important conversation that I think nation states have to have with each other about what are the appropriate boundaries here. And that, a conversation with another national leader can sometimes yield a difference of activity. And so we should make sure that we're trying that option to try and reduce the risk to the United States.
One of the things that was interesting, Sean, you had said it, like a lot of people don't understand cyber. That goes the same for like all the groups that have command and control, where there's like a flag officer giving orders to a 24-year-old who's carrying them out. Because I'm still shocked that somebody called Hafnium said, hey, there's a patch coming out, so let's hack 100,000 servers. I mean, that's a little loud. And you could almost see the command and control break down a little bit, where somebody said, hey, we've got a great access. We have an exploit that works. It's a 0-day. Don't lose access. And the 23-year-old interpreted that with, okay, so let's just hack the world. We're going to have a lot of orders given by folks who don't understand the tech, and the folks on the front lines that implement it, you're going to see a disconnect there from time to time.
I would say, given the amount of time that I spend thinking about these things and working with these things inside the government and the amount of oversight that we have inside the Defense Department, I think mature nations need to have that. They need to have very clear understandings of what their forces are doing, that they're not doing things that they don't intend. And I'm not sure that all nations have that kind of insight into what's happening at other levels. And I think it's one of the basic principles of the United States military. And I think that we should be striving towards that in cyberspace as well.
And what do you think can be done to improve that? I think from your prior approach to the FBI and from your current approach?
I think there's a bunch of things. Like I mentioned that multi-pronged approach, but I want to bring it back to the companies out there that are actually getting hit every day. And this is where I think you get into the JCDC that Director Easterly mentioned. Like, we have to make some type of hardwire where the private sector actually shares all of that information without repercussion. There has to be some type of standard hygiene that is out there. But if they're able to provide the government, and the government, it's a two-way street, right? That is a team sport there. It's a two-way street. But if they're able to get that picture of what that risk looks like, Jen's going to be able to do her job much better in that defend mission, right? We collectively, as in the private sector, are going to be able to understand the risk and defend it better. And it's also going to give, I think, the policymakers actually better information to have those discussions through the State Department, the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, to really, I think, combat the issue.
Yeah, I would say for the private sector, from a deterrence perspective, making sure that you are resilient to try and prevent some of those collateral impacts is really important, because there's a lot of deterrence that can happen against those criminal actors if people are in a position that it doesn't really provide an interruption. And it's the interruption that creates the motivation to pay. And so if people are resilient and it just sort of rolls off, then the criminal's not going to be able to cause that kind of incident. But that's not something that we in the government can, have a lot of control or insight into.
Kevin, anything you'd add here? Okay. So I wanted to come back to this question a moment ago that you had brought up about roles in the government, and just thinking about outside of law enforcement actions, how does the government demonstrate to the public that it's countering adversaries when cyber ops are often only working when they are done in secret? I don't know how you think about this, Mieke. I think
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a really tough thing, because in the department we don't discuss operational activity, but we are part of whole of government efforts to defend the nation, and that's been part of our mission since 2018. Elections defense, and then you see us moving into that in the ransomware space. But those missions are not DoD alone. They are in support of our law enforcement partners. They are in support of DHS and how we work with them. And I think that we play an important role. Our capabilities are pointed outside the United States, but that's where often the adversaries are. And so we can help a lot identify tactics, techniques that the adversary is using, help locate, do all kinds of things like that to make law enforcement's job easier. But I think that it's really important for the American people to see, especially with the ransomware, that law enforcement is taking a public role in disrupting these kinds of activities. I mentioned a couple of incidents of this before, but also with indictments, trying to arrest individuals when they travel to third countries, arrest them if they come to the United States, putting out indictments so that it's very clear what that we deem this activity as criminal and not legitimate. I think that those kinds of things are really important. The department's activities will necessarily not be something that we'll spend a lot of time talking about. Hopefully for the reporters listening, please don't make me have to talk about them by writing really interesting articles. But I think it is something that there are ways that the American people can have confidence that their government is actually doing a lot more to defend against this particular threat. And we can talk about the mission that we've taken on.
So I would agree with you, and I think, right, everyone knows the FBI has a dual mission. It has an intelligence mission and it has a law enforcement. I think we could do a better job with the takedown as we did recently, tracking the cryptocurrency and actually recovering that. And I think we can also accentuate the cooperation with the private sector. So I think that's important, and I think we can be more transparent doing that. Also, though, let's not forget, out in the private sector, there are a lot of cleared individuals, right? And we should be having that dialogue with them on the intelligence side to the extent that we can, right? And basically ensuring them that some of that is being met. I mean, that's very hard when you get into an intelligence operation, as far as it's just not going to go public. It's not sort of the nature of what they do in revealing techniques, tactics, and protocols, right? So I think it's a challenge. And Kevin, I'd be interested what you think on that. No, because you've done a lot of work. And when you did that first thing on the PLA, right, that foreshadowed, and you went to Congress.
Yeah. To me, we can't just always play defense. I've said this for like 20 years. No matter what company you are with, no matter how many great people you have, great technology you can have a bad day. On offense, even the crappiest hockey players, if they get 1,000 shots on goal, will put the puck in the net. And so I like what I'm seeing. I can sense there's going to be change, but nations do have to hold other nations accountable for harboring the criminal element, period. However, they got to do that. If you can't get to the person, and you may not be able to, you have to hold the nations accountable. So I think attribution matters, and that our government, to me, attribution, the private sector can do the best they can there, but the reality is the sovereign nations are the ones that are going to have the bar for what's the line for attribution and confidence level, and then hold nations accountable to it. The private sector will do its best. I can tell you the top board topic right now is resiliency. How do we make sure we can recover from backups, not pay a ransom, and have our core assets up and running in 6 hours? So the private sector, though, doesn't want to just play defense. They want to know that the people that are causing us harm, I don't think Joe Blount should have had to go through what he went through. I don't think Frank Casilla had to go through what he went through. These are good people. They were attacked. We need to impose risks and repercussions, and I think we have a government that's willing to do that. And I think we know, even internationally, I think you're going to see more effort to get attribution right. And we don't even need perfect. Just get to the right country, get to the right citizens behind it.
Yeah, you and Jen talked about the voluntary reporting, and I think this is actually really important. Even if companies get to the point where a ransomware attack is a resilient thing that's sort of a hassle and then they move on, it's really important for those of us who are on offense that people report those incidents, because then we can start understanding what kinds of victims attackers are going after. The government may be able to do something to help, but if people pay and don't say anything, then we don't necessarily know what the depth of capability is of the adversary and what kinds of targets they're going after. So it's really important that when people get hit, they are reporting to law enforcement, they're sharing that incident. I know it's really scary to sort of talk about it because, as Kevin's clients well know, that's a bad day for anybody. But we will be able to do something, or we hope that we will be able to do something if you tell us. We certainly won't be able to do anything if you don't tell us.
I appreciated your point, Sean, before about if 80 to 90% of the risk is in the private sector, that 80 to 90% of the intel should be coming from there.
But to kind of add on to what they're saying, and Kevin was mentioning, at the boardroom, this is the issue, right? And I would say it's the issue because regulators are actually stepping up. Right, so I'm working with boards where regulators are actually looking at them for their oversight of this risk. But I think we got to get, again, cyber risk, right? Well, what about those end-of-life systems, right? There's a lot of tech risk out there in tech debt that a lot of us call it, right? And they're not. It's hard to separate those. Right, and so I just think, these regulators, they need to get knowledgeable in this area, and it goes back to, what is the FTC doing? What is the CFPB doing? The OCC and Fed, I think most of us know in financial services, they're pretty active. The SEC is looking to do more in that area. I think, I would ask all our regulators need to step up, and the expectations from management and even boards.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing that. You're seeing that from Treasury now, right? Taking action against a crypto exchange. I think that and I would not expect that that'll be the last one, but to the extent that there are these exchanges that are facilitating criminal proceeds and are not able to show that their transactions are legitimate, I think that Treasury is looking very carefully at how to deal with that.
I want to come back to a point that you had started to make, Kevin, around sort of attribution and just how complicated it is here in this space between nation states and organized crime. And to this question of sort of cyber mercenaries, private actors that are operating at the behest of nation states, some of whom might actually be U.S. allies, and how you're thinking about distinguishing between these actors and criminal groups, thinking like UAE and their operations against Iran, dark matter, where are we in terms of attribution?
I think the government has more tools to get it right. the private sector, we usually see it at victim networks. If an adversary is good, they can stay anonymous. As long as they're not lazy and they don't have an operational security blunder, it gets really hard. I'll just share it this way. In 2010, we've responded to about, 5,000, 6,000 breaches in the last 20 years. And we've always codified the trace evidence left behind in real nerdy ways with great rigor and discipline. We threw it in a database. In 2010, we only had 40 groups. Like everything we were responding to went nice and neatly into 40 different buckets. Oh, it's these guys from China. Oh, it's the Russian FSB again, or whatever it was. And now we're up to like 2,900 buckets. It may really only be 40, but everybody's changing so fast that the evidence we see today from the same hacker group is different than 3 months ago. So it's another number, and we're trying to join groups. Anonymity, the best hackers in the world are probably pretty darn anonymous. I think you get to the country, and then I think the government resources will get to the country. I do believe that. The challenge we have is this. If there ever is an attack that exploits the systemic risk we have, and we don't even know who did it, how do we proportionally respond? I think the whole game comes back to attribution. Because if something happens and we just don't like it as a nation, if we know who did it, let's go do something about it, whatever that may be, economic sanctions, diplomatic relations, whatever. But from my company's perspective, attribution is getting more complicated.
And why, Kevin, do you see the proliferation from the 40 to the hundreds?
I think our defense is actually getting better so that the TTPs do have to change. I mean, you can't use IP address anymore for attribution. It just changes every single intrusion anyway. You know, for the SolarWinds intrusions, everybody had the attackers used a unique IP address set for every single victim. So, and then it never got used again. So the whole infrastructure was burned. Same thing I remember back in the Sony breach. The whole infrastructure used to do that breach. It was burned during that breach and never used again. So it's just, I think as our defense actually gets better, you force things like this year, we're having more 0 days than, I don't know, the last 5 years combined, it feels like, you know? And that means defense is getting better. The problem is we'll always have imperfect defense, so we got to think about imposing risk and consequence.
Okay, one last question. I think we have maybe 1 or 2 minutes left, but just wanted to quickly touch on cyber terrorism. There's been a lot of conversation about, is this an unrealistic threat? Is it not? Is it possible that small groups or even individuals could cause a catastrophic incident? And if so, what does that really mean for the United States?
It's a great question. So I'll take the
How
first.
many ideas do we want to have go public on this one? Huh?
I would just say historically, terrorism was handled in a different way to neutralize the terrorists. And most terrorist groups thought it was to their disadvantage to use or have a digital footprint. So I don't think we saw a lot of activity in that space. I think more concerning is what we saw with the Israeli water supply system and what was done there. And when you're looking at more nation-state, bioterrorism type activities that are more concerning. But I'm not, I'll defer to my DOD colleague if she wants to comment more on that.
Shamika's really glad you deferred to her.
I know. I don't know that there's a whole lot I can say about this. I think, certainly it's on our list of threats that we're tracking, and I think that beyond that, I'm gonna not say anything.
Kevin?
Bottom line, as the impact grows to cyber breaches, it'll be a tool used by more and more entities. Anytime there's geopolitical difference or ideological difference, you got to perceive a threat to the nation.
Well, on that sobering point, thank you all so much for your time here. It's been a really great conversation. I appreciate it.